Hello, I'm Thomas Hall, Executive Director of Clean Start, and welcome to today's Clean Start Perspectives. First off, I want to recognize our supporters of Clean Start Perspectives. That is SMUD, our local utility, with their net zero or with their absolute zero by 2030 goal, Bloom Co-working Spaces, Fresno State's Wet Center. It's part of the CEC Innovation Cluster around clean technology that Clean Start's part of. River City Bank, one of the leading financiers of clean energy and sustainability projects in the Sacramento area, and Chico Start, which is an iHub in the North State where we go out and we talk as Clean Start about how the energy transition can impact them and that they can make money off of it. Next, I would like to welcome Mark Trexler, Director of Climatographers. He has been working in the space for decades, and we had him about a year and a half ago talk about what he's working on. And Gary said, we've got to have him back to talk about how things have changed since then. So I would like to welcome Mark Trexler and Gary Simon to today's discussion.
Thanks.
Okay. Back connected now. Well, all sorts of gremlins this morning, Mark.
Uh-huh.
I think it's Elon Musk. Oh, have you recovered yet from November 5th?
I don't think there's any way to recover from November 5th.
Well, tell us, with the perspective that you had of a few days to think about it, what's the biggest fundamental change in the area of carbon trading, uh, climate change? I know we'll probably withdraw from the Paris Agreement. But what fundamentally changes? Because you still have companies interested in getting carbon offsets to meet goals they've promised their shareholders. You still have a lot of states that are interested. So just give us your first impression as to, what are the big things that have changed?
Well, there are two big things that have changed in the last 2 weeks. One is, of course, the election. And it'll be interesting to see whether the U.S. actually pulls out. You've got the chairman of Exxon saying that the U.S. shouldn't pull out. I think makes a lot of business sense and even policy sense to stay in, even if only you can much more easily control something that you're part of than you can control something that you're not part of. So I think we'll see. I don't think it's necessarily taken for granted. But it'll have big implications. I mean, the Kyoto Protocol, when it was signed in 1997, took 8 years to come into force, was going to be this big program, et cetera. But the U.S. never ratified the Kyoto Protocol. And that was almost a death knell, because the U.S. and the demand that was supposed to be in the carbon market was largely based on U.S. participation. And so when the U.S. didn't participate in that market, it pretty much killed it. And it'll be interesting to see whether the same thing happens now, because the other big thing that's changed is in Baku at the 29th Conference of the Parties. They did actually approve a framework for carbon trading under Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, which people have been discussing for years and years and years and working on for years and years and years. And the framework was just approved a few weeks ago by sort of the body of experts working on it. And then it sort of got rammed through in Baku with almost no discussion whatsoever, which a lot of people were surprised at. But this sets up a whole new trading framework, allowing countries to, again, in some ways like the Kyoto Protocol, allowing countries to trade carbon to meet their nationally defined contributions more cost competitively. And by one estimate, it should save the world $250 billion, the ability to trade. But there are big questions about how this will actually work, whether the reductions and credits will be real, whether we'll have the same problems we have had with the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. And you combine that with a lot of uncertainty, I think, here in California and Oregon and Washington about what happens next with trading. We're sort of in this interesting spot where prices are beginning to get relevant. You can't just ignore a $30 carbon price, and what does that mean in terms of will people suddenly start objecting more, et cetera? I think carbon markets internationally and even here on the West Coast are really entering into a pretty substantially uncertain period, and right now unknowable as to how it plays out.
So, I mean, I presume there's no direct connection to the carbon markets on the West Coast. But what you're saying is there's clearly going to be some influence, particularly if you can trade some of those offsets in a broader geography. Is that a correct interpretation?
No, I don't. I think it's more just the fact that there are a whole set of uncertainties around the international carbon market. There are a whole set of uncertainties around the voluntary carbon market and where it's headed after a very convoluted, disrupted last 2 years. And even here on the West Coast, where we have at least 2 regulated markets, and presumably Oregon will come back in here relatively soon. So we'll have 3 regulated carbon markets on the West Coast, potentially working together. But even there are big uncertainties. It's a very different uncertainty in the sense that, prices in the California system historically have been de minimis, $15 for years and years and years and years. And now they're getting up $25, getting close to $30, bouncing around a little bit. Some people are saying that by 2030, it'll be $130 a ton. But, will the market really support that? And we're really getting both in California and in Washington, presumably in Oregon, we're sort of going to have to face for the first time the idea that market prices are getting to the point where people will really notice. And what will that mean for the politics and the policy of these markets?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you've made the point many times that the voluntary carbon market is a little bit of a shambles because of the whole verification validation issue with what you're actually trading there. Has there been any change in that market?
Well, I mean, there have been several initiatives in the last couple of years to quote unquote shore up the voluntary market, the Integrity Council, et cetera. I mean, lots of reports being produced. Whether it actually has much of an effect on the market, still very unclear. Prices are still very low. I mean, $5 a ton in many cases for prices, which obviously is not accomplishing very much. I mean, there's been a big push in the last year and a half on trying to get people to start buying direct air capture credits and more expensive credits that are in the $500 a ton range. But obviously nobody's going to buy those at scale. And the general, you've got some tech companies that are forward buying some of those things to help get some of these technologies off the ground. But the market as a whole is not going to embrace $500 credits when you can go out and buy a credit for $5.
Well, and in the real credit market in Europe, meanwhile, California offsets have been trading at $20, $30 a ton of CO2. Aren't the European markets still in the $50, $60 range?
Yeah, they've gotten higher than that. They've gotten into the 80s. And so the right now the market there is relatively robust. What that really ends up meaning for CO2 reductions over time, still a little bit unclear, because that's really just in the last couple of years that market has really recovered. At one point it was a couple bucks. Now it's getting close to 100. But there, you always have these confounding factors, of course, because in Europe you've got the border carbon adjustment that is going to be coming into place where they'll be imposing a carbon price at the border on products coming in from around the world if there is no carbon market in the originating location. That is probably, you know, that's probably the biggest climate change policy innovation in the last couple of years, is the border carbon market adjustment. Because if different countries started to adopt that, it would have a huge impact. And what it does is encourage the places, whether it's China, India, et cetera, even the US potentially, it says, look, if you're not going to put a price on carbon at your end, we'll put it on at our end, and you'll miss out on a huge source of revenue. So put a price on carbon at your end, then we won't tax it when it comes into Europe. You'll have all that money to do with as you please. And so it really is an incentive to get other people to adopt carbon pricing, and we'll see how that pans out.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, in terms of population, the European market, I think, is somewhere around 500 million people. Depends on how you count the UK, and a few other things. Is that about right? Is that the sort of total market that's participating in some of these new rules you've discussed?
Yeah, I mean, the UK won't be part of that carbon market adjustment, at least directly, since they're not part of the EU. But yeah, it's a pretty good sized market. And of course, you know, countries like China and India are somewhat alarmed by this prospect, and so it's not in place yet, and it starts with certain sectors and then expands to other sectors, but it's potentially a game changer in terms of sort of how carbon pricing plays across sort of the global landscape.
Well, looking at that, just what I'm seeing in the data and what some analysts have said, it seems like we're destined to exceed the trigger that we've been trying to stay below in terms of average global temperature. If you just look at the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, there was all this talk about the trigger is 450 parts per million. Well, we're going to go past that. And then I see other people saying, well, no, it's actually 500 and some parts per million, but we're going to go past that. So what that tends to say to me is, oh, great, you know, we're going to go more to try to do geoengineering to stay below certain levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, because people will say the policy things that we've been discussing clearly not adequate. What's your view?
Well, first, just the clarification that most of the geoengineering and climate engineering are sort of these enormous terms that do encompass all kinds of technologies, some of which do have a direct impact on CO2. So if you did ocean fertilization, for example, that would pull down CO2. But a lot of the technologies that we're talking about don't actually have any impact on the CO2. They just have an impact on the temperature by deflecting more sunlight back into space. And so you know, you'll still have the CO2, you'll still have the ocean acidification, even if you had a successful geoengineering program based on sulfur particles or similar kinds of things in the upper atmosphere. You know, it's unfortunate because we're having basically the same conversation in this space that, you know, that we're having in the nuclear energy space, in terms of we're not having a conversation, we're just turning into a circular firing squad where you can't actually even discuss some of these topics without just engendering vitriol and backlash. So you know, when it comes to the geoengineering, anybody who suggests geoengineering in the sort of the scientific world is immediately labeled somebody that doesn't want to do emissions reductions. Well, that's not true. I mean, the point of the geoengineering conversations is, well, you know, if we're not going to do the emissions reductions that we clearly should be doing, and if temperature is going to start rising significantly to dangerous levels, at some point, we're going to, whether we prepare for it or not, people are going to start doing things in that would be called geoengineering. And unless we've thought about it, planned for it, researched it, we're going to be in a much worse position than if we did think about it, plan for it, research it. And so they're calling for the research so that we'll know what works, what doesn't work, et cetera. But the conversation is just so polarized within the climate community right now that it's destructive, self-destructive.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, obviously, we've been talking a lot about carbon offsets that just kind of slow down the emissions. But the other side of this one is, direct reductions of carbon in the atmosphere. Direct capture, so far, very expensive. Some innovators out there think they can cut that price down to $100 a ton, yet to be seen. But what carbon negative things can people do out there? I mean, we've tried a number of things, injecting underground mineralization, and I've been fascinated by some studies that say, well, if you bury trees that you cut down deep in anaerobic conditions, they don't decay. So that's a way of cheaply sequestering carbon. Any of these carbon negative things making any sense to you?
Well, ironically, when I first started working on this issue in 1988, the first proposal I saw involved burying trees. So the very first proposal 36 years ago it was a fascinating proposal, somewhat hilarious, but fascinating. Let's bring sprinklers into Australia and let's build desal plants on the coast of Australia, and we'll use these sprinklers to recreate sort of the savannas of Africa in Australia, and we'll provide a habitat for endangered species, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We'll grow all of these trees, and when they're mature, we'll cut them down, we'll bury them underground with the salt from the desal plants, and they won't decay. It's interesting that 36 years later, what we're seeing is not so much, the idea that we would cut down and bury entire trees, I don't think is the way this will play out. But there are, people developing technologies of biomass briquettes, where you produce sort of this briquette of biomass and you seal it in, and then you bury millions of tons of these briquettes in a way that supposedly they won't decompose. And so you're getting at exactly the same idea, but you're not burying valuable trees, you're burying sort of waste biomass. What that'll end up costing and how does that possibly scale, in the sense that you can't be trucking waste biomass across the world for these things. And at what point does it start to impact soil fertility, et cetera? So, I mean, all of these things are tricky and trade-offs, but we are seeing sort of people experimenting with this idea of removing carbon and burying it. And we'll see how that plays out.
Well, there's never such thing as an old idea that's abandoned. It's just a matter of what time will it come back. Well, I mean, yeah, valuable trees. I've seen also taking species that don't seem to have any other use, something called a pongamia tree that's very fast growing. I don't know. I'm personally skeptical of anything that says inject something deep underground and it will stay there. That isn't the history of things injected deep underground.
Well, and we just had the experience in the last year of a very similar approach involving kelp, where the idea was that you'd grow the kelp and then you would drop the kelp into the deep ocean, where it would just stay, and that the company that had raised millions and millions of dollars for that just fell apart earlier this year. in part because it turned out they weren't doing what they said they were doing because they were never able to get that to work right. So they were doing other things, et cetera. But ultimately, the company fell apart. You know, a big part of the problem here is that how do any of these technologies really get off the ground if we haven't priced carbon in some way? I mean, if there is no policy framework to make these things happen, it's just very hard to see how this stuff happens, you know, on a purely voluntary, purely philanthropic basis of companies, you know, reducing their emissions, or even countries reducing their emissions. If we can't put into place the policy framework that drives these markets and drives these technologies, it's just very hard to see how this stuff ever materializes.
Yeah, that's a pretty important driver. And on the other side of it, looking into your crystal ball, do you see the new Trump administration and Mr. Drill Baby Drill in charge of the Department of Energy taking any legal action to try to dissolve carbon markets?
Well, I mean, you know, they've tried that before with California, and not so much carbon markets per se, but you know, emissions reduction initiatives and zero emissions vehicles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And California's ability to set its own standards, which has been important in some of these areas. You know, again, you don't to crater these markets and to crater climate change mitigation, you don't necessarily need to beat them in court. There are other ways to just make sure these things never get off the ground. So, you know, how it'll play out and how much effort they'll put into, you know, actively blowing up things that might already exist as opposed to just undermining everything now and into the future, I have no idea. But you know, we're off to a pretty interesting start in terms of who the people that might actually be in charge are likely to be. That's a little bit odd what we're seeing. But what their mandate will be from the dear chairman, it's hard to know.
Yeah, I don't even want to ask you what the things are that they could do to undermine and blow things up. I don't want anybody to talk about that, but it is interesting, given the experience of the first Trump term, that one of the commenters said, with all of these appointments, said, well, we now know the first 12 people that Trump will fire within the first 12 months of his administration.
Right. Yeah. I mean, who knows? And you know, if I mean, the interesting thing here is if one believes, for example, what Project 2025 says about the energy sector, et cetera, and carbon and climate change, then we're in for a very tough ride. But if one believes what Project 25 says about other things and what's going to be happening in parallel, you know, in a lot of respects, climate change is probably the least of our near-term worries. Mm-hmm. So who knows how it plays out? I mean, they don't have infinite resources to pull off this stuff and infinite political capital. How it plays out, I don't think anyone has any idea. But it is certainly sort of a deep uncertainty situation going forward.
Well, on the other side of it, in California, the Air Resources Board is engaged in a couple rulemakings that would have the impact of increasing the price of a carbon offset and also a low carbon fuel standard credit by changing basically what's the target or what's the neutral point in the case of carbon and fuels. And then that may more than double the prices of an offset and potentially bring a low carbon fuel credit up over $100. Do you see other states trying to do some of the same things to just change how these things are calculated and how many of them that you need to have the impact of increasing the price of carbon?
Yeah, there aren't. I mean, there are only a few states that are really playing in this game in terms of New York and a relatively few others. I think it is challenging to see how individual states sort of impose that kind of internal carbon price, if the neighboring states don't have it. I years ago, when the ARB was just starting to work on this, I was actually doing work for Pacific Gas and Electric on the California carbon market and what was going to happen. And I said, well, look, I mean, if the ARB were to implement this the way they are talking about implementing this, and this was, a decade plus ago, the price of credits would be north of $100 a ton. So I can guarantee you that that's not what's going to happen, because that's just not politically viable. And so, in fact, we were at $15 a ton for a decade. So now we're at $20, $30 a ton. It makes perfect sense to increase that price I mean, if you want, it depends what you're trying to accomplish. If you want to have a significant impact, I mean, right now, only 10% of emissions in California are from the electric sector, for example. Right. So, it's a relatively small thing, which means you're dealing with sectors that are harder to abate, and you're dealing with the transportation sector. To have, I mean, 30, 40, $50 has a pretty significant effect in a lot of electric grids, a carbon price. That's 1, 2, 3 cents a kilowatt hour for gas. That starts to have an impact. But in the transport sector, you're probably talking about needing to be at $200, $2 a gallon. At the current 30 cents a gallon, you're not having any impact on anything. And but is it plausible to say we're gonna increase gas prices in California by $1.50 a gallon just from the carbon trading system? People might be out in the street with pitchforks. We'll have to see. So people are talking about moving these markets in the right direction in order to have a real impact, which has not been the case up to this point. But will we run into sort of a political ceiling, so to speak, on how these things actually play out? I mean, we did dodge a bullet in Washington in terms of the effort to repeal the entire cap and trade system in this last election. And that failed by a pretty substantial margin, 60-40. So that was good news in terms of people didn't just throw the whole thing out. Although they did, in a separate measure, they did prohibit discriminatory practices against natural gas, as places like Berkeley and others have been trying to do, to outlaw gas in new buildings and that kind of things. So Washington actively prohibited those kinds of policies. So a little bit contradictory on the climate side. But again, as we get, if carbon prices, if the ARB starts to move carbon prices into the $40, $50, $60 range, I will be very interested to see how that plays out and what that triggers, that we just haven't seen triggered so far, because it just doesn't matter.
No, I understand that. Well, the other thing in terms of a business reaction to all of this, sometimes businesses can deal with the higher prices on offsets. If they can lock them in over a future period, then they have certainty as to what it's going to do. Obviously, one of the big uncertainties in a lot of businesses is the future price of fuel and even of electricity. So markets have emerged that will price out gas, oil, electricity for 10 years and sometimes more. I haven't seen that in carbon offsets yet. We have some far forward market, but not that many years. Is there anything more that's going on there, and anything that you would see emerging in forward markets?
Well, I mean, the closest thing to a real forward market is sort of this mini market in the direct air capture space, where people are buying forward for 10-year plus commitments. Historically, you're right, that has not been the case, and one of the real challenges of carbon markets has been that you can't really have a viable carbon market if people are only buying year to year credits. I mean, from the standpoint of developing credible projects, you're basically shooting yourself in the head if everything is on a year to year spot basis, because no one in their right mind would spend real money on real projects with no idea, what the demand for that product is in year 2 through 10, much less year 2 through 30. So there really is a need for that kind of a market, and for people to be doing serious forward buying. But again, how do you do that when the market is we have no idea where this market is going to be? I mean, is it going to be $5, $10, $15, $100? I've talked to investors who are trying to decide whether they should start, really investing in California allowances as a business proposition, based on the fact that you can buy it today at 30 and it might be worth 100 in 5 years. And I've simply tried to point out to them that that might be true, but the risks of that investment for a commodity that has no intrinsic value at all, it's purely based on the policy framework that you're operating within. Just be very prepared for risk, and be willing to accept a lot of risk in investing in these markets. And I think the same goes for the idea of serious forward purchases. If people do a serious forward purchase for $5 a ton stuff, sure, they could do that, but then they'll be pilloried for buying $5 a ton credits. Very few people can do serious forward purchases for $50 or $100 a ton credits. It's just such a fragile structure that we're still operating within, that how do you really do the kind of long-term planning that you otherwise would do for aviation fuel, where people are doing that kind of stuff all the time?
Well, it's true. I mean, there is in Europe a pretty strong sustainable aviation fuel credit market, and those numbers are pretty high. But I think one of the implications of what you just said is, given the election results of November 5th, we're injecting a lot of uncertainty. And so if there was anything starting to emerge on a 10, 15-year forward price, it's probably shattered by now, because you have no idea where things are going. So right. That makes
we just keep adding to the uncertainty. We seem totally incapable. We're adding to the uncertainty on the climate side itself. In 2023, the parts per million in the atmosphere rose by, I saw a number recently, 3.5 ppm in 1 year. That was a record. That's never happened before. So was that an anomaly? Does that mean that that suddenly something's happening with the terrestrial sinks or the oceanic sinks for carbon, and so we're going to start seeing these higher numbers? Because if that happens, then all our estimates of climate change itself are off. There's more uncertainty today than there was a few years ago on climate change, more uncertainty on climate litigation, more uncertainty on climate policy. I mean, we just keep adding to the uncertainty, which just complicates decision making.
Well, yeah, it's not a pretty picture. And I have no idea how this resolves, whether we have to, permanently see an ocean temperature in the Gulf of over 100 degrees, or we have to invent a new Category 6 hurricane, because that's what we're seeing. or what. Um, but to have a nominee for the Department of Energy say um, there is no climate change, there is no energy transition, is a little shattering. Uh,
Well, and
so,
that's what's sort of interesting to see here when I talk to companies, et cetera. Right now companies are being told you have to not only disclose your climate risks, blah blah blah. We're sort of expecting this disclosure regime to lead to mitigation, which is fundamentally pretty unrealistic.
mm,
But now, companies in Europe are being required to prepare their climate transition plans and publish their climate transition plans for 1.5 degrees.
mm,
But we're not going to. I mean, 1.5 degrees is a dead duck. 2 degrees is a very sick duck.
mm,
I mean, chances are we're headed for between 2.5 and 3 to be a bit optimistic. Um, and so, number one, the idea of you would never actually seriously start planning for a 1.5 degree transition if the actual number is 2.5.
mm.
That would be business suicide to be doing that. So by not constraining some of these basic climate uncertainties, you're making it almost impossible for companies to act rationally in terms of figuring out what they should be doing today. It's just yeah just the whole metaphor of decision making under deep uncertainty is an academic literature that a lot more people should be getting a lot more familiar with.
Yeah. Well, and you've made that happen by educating us this morning, Mark, for which we thank you. And we are going to have to check back in, but learned many things in this discussion that I didn't realize. And, you know, that's why, the work that you're doing is very important. So thank you very much for joining us. We'll be making this recording available.
Okay,
And
Gary. Well, always good to chat with you, and I'm sure it's been thoroughly uplifting. But we'll do it again.
well, I would look forward to that. But for now, thanks for the information. We'll keep an eye on some more of the milestones that you've pointed out here. And back over to you, Thomas.
All right. I'd like to thank Mark again for joining us. Always love to hear about it, how a good Pagovian tax is working in the world. Um, Also want to thank our supporters out there again for making this possible, and want to encourage people to come and check out our Clean Tech Holiday Meetup. That's actually with all the people in the entrepreneurship community on December 11th, and our applications are opening for our Clean Tech Accelerators for 2025. You can go check that out on our website. And if you want to learn more about what Mark Trexler is doing, you can follow him on LinkedIn, where he shares a lot of good content. And also check out climatographer.com. And you can also look up what he has behind him there, the Climate Web, to learn more about that. So thank you all for coming. Connect with us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Empower Innovation, YouTube, and more. Thank you all for coming. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks so much.